Hello everyone and welcome to a most peculiar game from the penultimate round of this year's Reykjavik Open. We have a first-time appearance on this channel by women grandmaster and international master Leya Garifullina. She's 19 years old and in 2019 she won the World Under-16 Championship for girls, so she's a world champion. And her opponent, none other than the great Vasyl Ivanchuk, who has been featured on this channel more times than, well, maybe only Magnus has been featured more, but you know that when Ivanchuk is playing, if he has a good day, you don't stand a chance, even if you're using an engine, and on a bad day, of course, anything is possible. But on this particular day, and for this particular game, they managed to play a game where no mistakes were made. So this is a mistakeless game, but still one of the players won. So that's very interesting. And you know, we've had occasions where Ivanchuk did something similar with other opponents, but yeah, it's just a really weird situation. So let's check it out and why this is so impressive. Leya, with the white pieces, opens with pawn to e4. And so far in the tournament, Leya lost only one game, but she has a lot of wins, and the Vasyl is still undefeated in the tournament. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. Leya goes for the Ruy Lopez, pawn to a6, Vasyl counters with the Morphy's defense, bishop to a4, and now the fairly rare g6, the so-called deferred fianchetto defense, where you will put a bishop on g7, not you know, an everyday occurrence in the Ruy Lopez, but okay, it has been played by some incredibly strong players. And pawn to d4, usually c3 is played here, or even castle, but pawn to d4 is what Leya goes for, and it has been played in top level chess, but almost all of the games ended in a draw. Yanni Pomnici played it against Nakamura, as Nakamura is a frequent user of this defense with black. Also Grishu played against Nakamura, Ivanchuk played it with white, also against Ponomarev. Dominguez played it against Nakamura, so yeah, it has been played on the top level. We have pawn to b5, chasing away the bishop, bishop to b3, and e captures on d4. And now we have pawn to c3, so offering a gambit of a pawn. And there is one very elite player that has used this opening once successfully, and that is Wei Yi, who we all love to see. And you don't capture the pawn. If you capture the pawn, then you run into trouble. After knight captures on c3, it's just incredibly difficult to develop with black. You should play something like d6, but then you're just weakening everything. And if you try to go, you know, by the path of development, then let's say bishop g5 attacks the queen, and then after you block this, you run into knight to d5, and it's just weird. I mean, if you castle, white always has this knight to f6 check. You will have to give up the bishop. Let's say if you castle, queen to d2 even, and once knight to f6 check is played, if you trade, then queen can already come to h6. This is terrible for black. So that's why after c3, Vasyl of course just goes bishop to g7, c captures on d4, knight to g to e7, and now pawn to d5, chasing away the knight, knight to a5, attacking the bishop, and now bishop to d2, offering the light square bishop, but the threat is not bishop captures on a5. What Leya wants to do is put the bishop on c3 and counter Vasyl's strong bishop on g7. And knight captures on b3 is what was played in the game that I've mentioned by Wei Yi. His opponent captured on b3 and lost the game, even though it's the top move recommended by the engine. But here Vasyl goes pawn to c5. Of course, as usual, we trust Ivanchuk more than the engine. We have bishop to c3. Bishop captures on c3. And again, there are some games in the database where knight captures on c3 was played. But here Leya plays b captures on c3. And it is now, as of move 12, that we have a completely new game. So, okay, pawn to d6 makes sense. You don't want to see d6, or also you want to control the e5 square. Knight b to d2, and now pawn to f6 also. Nicely countering the knight on f3, stopping any future chances of e5 happening, and preparing pawn to g5. That's the way Vasyl wants to play this. We have castles by Leya, and now pawn to g5. And here, look at this, pawn to e5. Just giving up a pawn to free up the e4 square for the knight. And okay, you can't obviously capture with the f-pawn, but you can capture with the d-pawn, as you should. And now knight to e4. As the f6 pawn has been weakened, this knight is, well, a nuisance to say the least. And also, If instead of knight to e4, you play d6, that's very possible. I'm just going to show you d6, and you don't want to capture here, but also you kind of have to. The best would be to play knight to g6, but just to give you an idea of what happens, knight to e4, you offer a queen trade, but the problem is after queen captures on d1, you have a nice Zwischenzug at knight captures on f6 check as the bishop covers f7, so the black king cannot attack the knight on f6, and after the king moves, you will pick up the queen with check, and once the king moves, you will play rook f to e1, and the white has full development and will enjoy a much better game. So instead, after d captures on e5, knight to e4 was played by Leya, and now knight to g6. We have queen to we have knight captures on c5. You could also go for d6 here. She decides to go for knight captures on c5, and now queen to b6. Now, the real trick here, for example, if you castle with black here, d6 check is very annoying. And after you play knight captures on b3 and a captures, it's still a very annoying pawn. Also, queen to d5 check, already threatening to win the rook on a8, so you're going to have to deal with that. You play bishop f5, you connect everything. Now, b4, you cemented the knight on c5. You have a beautiful pass pawn on d6. You can maybe even double up on the a file, go after the a6 pawn. And the a6 pawn is hanging already, so it will be very hard to play this with black. But in the game, queen to b6 was played, the top move, of course, by Vasyl. What else do you expect? Knight to e4, shifting the attention to that d6 square and also putting pressure on f6. And here, Vasyl just castles and invites the advancement of the pawn to d6, which Leya does. Pawn to d6 check, king to g7, and now pawn to d7. Look at this magnificent pawn. Bishop to b7, attacking the knight here, and here Leya just plays queen to d6. As the queen on b6 is also hanging. So while you could trade, Vasyl plays queen to c6 instead. Just puts more pressure on the knight, and he says, all right, if a trade will happen, it will happen on c6, as he wants his bishop attacking the d7 pawn after he captures. So queen captures, we have bishop captures, and now knight back to c5. Defending the d7 pawn, knight to f4, and it looks a bit tricky. By playing knight to c5, you are defending the pawn, but you're also threatening knight to e6 check to fork the king and the rook, and it seems like you can play g3 here to kick away the knight and win material, but this would be a recipe for disaster. Look at this, knight h3 check, king g2, knight captures on b3. First, a nice and important Zwischenzug going after the rook on a1, and after you recapture g4, and that's it. There's not much you can do here. Of course, if you go after the rook, then you just get checkmated. Bishop captures on f3 will be checkmate. So after knight to f4, rook f to d1, putting the rook behind the passed pawn, as one always should, and now knight to b7. Now, this game is sort of as Vasyl Ivanchuk is famous for saying the strongest move to find is a move with with the knight back. And in this game, it just seems like Vasyl went back with his knights all the time, as you'll see. So knight captures on b7, bishop captures, now rook to d2, guarding that e2 square, so you don't have to worry about any knight to e2 checks, and also just preparing to castle, or maybe you want to bring the rook to e1. Very nice move. Rook f to d8, and now knight to e1, guarding the g2 square, as it is attacked by the knight and the bishop, and you are maybe thinking about g3, because now you have freed up the f1 square for your king, but it's still not going to be easy to play this. Bishop to c6, going after the d7 pawn, and now rook to d6. This is an incredibly strong move, forcing the bishop to capture. Of course, if rook captures, you're just going to blunder the bishop. So bishop captures on d7, and now rook 8 to d1. And now Ivanchuk has to deal with this very unpleasant pin. You can't really move the bishop, as it's a light square bishop. You cannot defend the rook on a dark square. So how do you deal with this? Well, rook to a7. This is the only move that keeps Ivanchuk in the game. And now the question is, can you play g3? If you can play g3, kick away the knight and get the bishop to e6, the game is over. You're just going to win a piece, and that's it. The problem is, if you play g3 here, then there's this annoying knight to e2 check, and after king to g2, there's knight captures on c3, so you don't have time for bishop to e6, as the rook on d1 is hanging. And once you attack the knight, knight comes to e4, attacks the other rook, and once you move this rook, and notice that the only square left for the rook on the d file is the d5 square, and this blocks bishop to e6, and then you can just bring the rook into the game. And now if pawn to f3, you try to kick away the knight, now there's even knight to c5, and everything is nicely defended. You kick away the rook, and the game just continues. You pick up the bishop, and the black has a winning advantage advantage. So after rook to a7, rook 1 to d2, stopping the idea of knight to e2 check, and now just knight back to g6. Again, going for even further back to keep an eye on e6 and d7. And now, of course, if bishop to e6, you don't care. You're just going to play knight to f8, and everything is nicely defended. So here, knight to d3. She's trying to get the knight all the way to c5, but the problem is for this one move, this disconnects the rooks, and it allows Ivanchuk to unpin here, and he goes rook to c8. Now, the rook is in the game. Knight to b4 now, going after the pawn here, and now knight to f8. Also, the bishop is hanging, so you have to defend it. Knight to f8. Knight captures on a6. She wins back her pawn, and rook captures on c3. Ivanchuk grabs another pawn. And now, if you don't want to worry about rook to c1 check, you should kind of create some breathing room for your king. So pawn to h3 and pawn to h5. And here she goes back. Knight to b4. We have pawn to h4, limiting the movement of that king side even further, and now king to h2. So she doesn't have to worry about any back rank checks. Rook to c5. And here, okay, rook to b6, putting more pressure on this b5 pawn. And still, you have to be mindful a little bit. If the other rook comes to d6, then f6 becomes weak, and so on. So she plays, Ivanchuk plays bishop to f5, and now comes rook to d8, putting pressure on the knight here, and it could be dangerous if you allow the other rook to double up. So here, rook to c8, and only now rook back to d6. And 39 moves have been played. One more move needs to be made in order for them to reach time control. She's a little bit better on the clock. Vasyl was around 3 minutes on the clock at this point, and he goes for knight to d7, just defending f6. This knight just, well, we have to call it a magnificent steed. There is no other way to complement it. Rook captures on b5. She wins back the pawn, and now the material is equal. And look at this. Knight to c5. Now comes knight to c6. And here comes rook to d7. Just offering a rook trade, and here we have rook captures on c5, eliminating the defender of the rook. So of course rook captures on d6, and now there, interestingly, there is only one move that keeps Leya in the game, and that is knight to e7, the move from the thumbnail, and that is exactly the move that she played. And it was in this position on move 43 that Vasyl Ivanchuk resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Or maybe there is. He decided that there isn't, and he resigned here because what do you play? The rook is attacked, and also the bishop is attacked. The bishop will fall with check, and this will nicely connect with check with the rook on d6. So he just resigned here, but let's explore the position a little bit. So, okay, there's not much to think about here. You have to capture on c5, and now after knight captures on f5 check, king to g6, knight captures on d6 check. And okay, it's 2 pieces for the rook, and also there's the passed a pawn to worry about here. But the problem is the inactivity of the white king. And now if we just continue playing this, let's say pawn to f5, pawn to f3, and now king to f6. And for those of you who are saying, but yeah, you should always play this top engine move to hold this with black. No, every move pretty much with black here, you have like 5 moves that are okay to play with, and it's still a draw. So it's not like there was a one miraculous line that holds the position. It's actually a drawn endgame. Point is that, okay, let's try to get the king into the game. What happens? Rook to c3, and okay, king f2, rook to c1, black just waits, and now after king to e3, you give a check, rook to e1 check, and now if the king goes queenside, you go after the g2 pawn, which cannot be defended, so you have to go back, and now the rook goes back. So okay, we've established that the king cannot go forward. Now comes pawn to a4. Okay, the other thing white can do is start advancing the pawn. But you don't have a rook, so if you had a rook, you would just be able to push the pawn. Here you will have to try escorting the pawn with the bishop and the knight. So let's try that. Rook to c3 goes after the bishop, bishop to c4, and now rook to a3. But okay, not a problem. Bishop to b5, you defend the pawn. Next, you're going to attack the rook, you're going to cover the a5 square, and you're going to continue advancing the pawn. So definitely looks like a plan. King to e6, now comes knight to c4, attacks the knight. Let's say rook to a2 check, king goes back. And now you just continue checking. Rook to a1 check, king to, if you go king to f2, rook goes back with check. And if king to h2, now look at this. This king is not entering the game anytime soon. And now black starts pushing, e4. And okay, captures. And now what do you play with white? You have to keep an eye on the pawn. So let's say play knight e3. King comes into the game. And now after, let's say, knight to c2, rook to d1. Pawn to a5. Okay, you push the pawn. Rook back to c1. You play bishop to a4, defend the knight. Now comes king to c5. You can't play rook to e1. The knight covers that, but you don't need it. The king is covering. And okay, the bishop and pawn are blocking the king with the coverage of the b5 and b6 squares. But once you move that pawn, the king does get access to b6. So here, there's no way for white to continue. You will play g3 or something to get back into the game. Just rook b1. No worries there. G captures on h4. Again, you capture. You prevent king g3. And if king g2, rook b2. And now, of course, king to f1, king to d6. You don't care. And now you will either go after the pawn, depending on what white plays, or if king to e2, you can even play king to e5. And now, let's say pawn to a6. If you play king to f2, then just king to f4. If a6, then rook to a2. You go after the bishop, and that's pretty much it. There's no more ways to hold this. You either give up the pawn, or if you don't advance the pawn to a5, what are you even playing? And it's, I mean, very difficult to play this. King e3. Okay, the king can come here. Rook to a2. Again, not the best. And if you allow king to f4, then it's already black who's playing for the win here. So incredible game. Zero mistakes by either of them. It was very strongly played by both of them. But in the end, Ivanchuk just decided to resign here. Which is something that he does quite often. Not so long ago, we also had a game where Vasyl resigned in an objectively drawn endgame. And okay, of course, it does give the appearance that white is pushing for the win here. White does have the two pieces for the rook and the passed a pawn. But yeah, you have to take into consideration the inactivity of the white king, and then all things become possible. But regardless, huge congratulations to Leya Garifullina, 2019 under-16 world champion, for taking down the great Vasyl Ivanchuk. So we'll see what happens in the final round. And of course, I'm still looking very much forward to your suggestions. So yeah, that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Before resigning, always check if it's really time to resign. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But yeah, later on, if you check the position, you will see, okay, it's a 0-0 position. You will just feel bad. I don't know if you guys remember that story I've mentioned. A teammate of mine, he resigned in a position. It was an endgame, and he saw that his opponent started pushing his passed pawn, and that there was nothing that he could do. But he actually had a forced checkmate in 5. Well, it's not an easy one to find, and definitely one for the books. But he felt really bad after checking that after he resigned. So I always check. That's what I'm saying. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Luke Donato, John Tardif, BulletChessThriller.com, Alexander Aldrich, and Happy Nowruz from Dustin and Mohsen for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check upon your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.